All right, so thank you so much for taking the time to watch this and for giving me so much of your time here. Pretty excited about teaching this, and this will be lesson one of a series of 13 lessons that will walk you through just the basics of American military history. And there's going to be a few terms I'm going to impress upon you, and the first one being the American way of war and how we get to the American way of war. And we're going to try to set that stage here. So, quick introduction. My name is Shane, and I just retired from the Army Reserve. Spent the last several years, done as anybody that's ever been in the military, has done a number of jobs throughout my career. But I believe most important to the student taking this class is going to be the fact that I spent the last few years teaching for the Command and General Staff Officer College. I taught particularly some different subjects in the intermediate level education course, among them leadership and some history. And here we go with some history. So the American way of war is going to be a subject you hear me talk about repetitively throughout these following weeks, this 13 class series that we're going to embark upon here with day one. So the American way of war. In the American way of war, we got there somehow, right? So we have to go back to our the very beginning, the very origins of our colonists, those unique experiences. And those experiences came from a couple of different ways. Number one, they brought with them, when those colonists came to America, they brought with them European experiences. When the Pilgrims first came here in 1620, they came here with a unique set of experiences brought with them from Europe. And those experiences were built upon and expanded upon through those unique American experiences while they were here in the 150 years or so between the first Pilgrims landing here on Plymouth Rock in 1620 up to the American Revolution in 1776. Important to remember just a few things. They came here seeking religious freedom. They came here thinking they were going to be missionaries to the Native Americans living in the land at that time. The land was populated by Native Americans or American Indians at that time, and those Native Americans had a very unique way of warfare, very different from that unique experience, that unique European experience that the colonists had brought with them. And the fur trade was also existing here with some French influence and Spanish influence there. So those colonists came here with those unique European origins. They came here, they interacted with, fought with, traded with, and tried to minister to the Native Americans and learn from them through that, as well as participated in the fur trade here. So those unique American experiences led us up to the very origins of this American way of war that we're going to talk about at length. So it's a couple of pictures you see here in front of you I think are important to note. One being what we believe is the American militiaman. That's kind of how we view the American militiaman. This is kind of how we view the British troop of the time. It's important to remember that at this time in American history, we were British colonists. We were subject to the king. Ultimately, some conflicts there led to the American Revolution. But we weren't Americans. We were British colonists in a new land, in a new world, experiencing new things that brought us there. The 30 Years' War in Europe. This is one of your readings I'm going to assign you to read a little more in depth about that. The key thing I want you to remember is, as you read about it, if you haven't already, is why does this matter to American military history? Why does the 30 Years' War in Europe matter? And there's a few different reasons it does. Number one, it exposed that group, that people class, to unrestrained warfare. War was widespread. It had grown there. They had seen some religious persecution, some religious conflict there, and they'd also experienced the military revolution. So the warfare had significantly changed in Europe, because about this time we were seeing a shift from the old edge weapon way of warfare, the tertiary formation we're going to look at in a second, moving to an infantry line with the advent of gunpowder, and as well as many other changes in the way that the nobles, the ruling class, were fighting war. We saw a shift from nobility and knights owing allegiance to a king, to a power, and coming in and fighting for them, to more of a system where middle class, there was more of a money economy. We saw kings and legislatures being able to raise armies and fight on a larger scale. And with that increase in funding brought some increase in logistical capability as well. So the armies could be a little better equipped. They could be a little better fed, furnished. They could go on longer campaigns. They could fight for more sustained periods of time. Also, we saw some new military tactics come in. Like I mentioned, formations changed with the advent of gunpowder and arms being introduced to the battlefield. The old way of fighting with edged weapons changed and shifted. So colonists were bringing those experiences with them when they came to the Americas. Armies are growing larger, like I said. Transition from that feudal system of knights with allegiances to monarchy to more of a central government they were taxing the people, raising money. The middle class was starting to rise. They were making money. And armies could focus a little more on logistics and actually sustaining these campaigns. So instead of a single knight being going off, having to equip himself to join other knights to fight, we saw armies start to rise up that were logistically supplied. So a couple of formations. I've got a couple of videos I'm going to ask you to look at, some YouTube shorts that explain the tertial formation. The explanation of tertial formation is pretty robust in the video. Basically, it was a large square, and we see in this video, or this picture rather, in the upper left, we see the pikemen with their long spears sticking up to protect the swordsmen. So we would have a line of swordsmen up front, protected over by pikemen from the rear. So the front, the edge, if you will, is going to be very, very consistent. It's going to be edge weapon swordsmen fighting up front with the pike or the long spear protecting them from their rear. When gunpowder comes on the scene, we see the line formation start to form, and that is that shift that once muskets or early matchlocks are involved, we see this unaimed volley fire where two groups of soldiers are going to line up against each other, shoot at each other. They pretty much take turns. They were shooting. Everything would be off the commands of an officer in charge. So we see that shift from that tercio or a phalanx type formation to an infantry line. You would see the line supported by some artillery with some advancements in cannons. So let's throw up some more pictures here for you. We saw the advancements in cannons go from these heavy, unwieldy projectiles to more mobile, smaller, crude cannons that were drawn by horses as we move towards the American Revolution. So here we see on the left, on the left of the line of the screen, we see a hand cannon, which was very, very crude, very, very early in the advent of gunpowder, and the pike, that long spear we talked about. The hand cannon gave way to a matchlock, which was a little more formalized version of a pistol or a rifle, if you will, where a wick was lit. It would then strike a powder charge here that would ignite an explosion inside the barrel and fire a projectile at the enemy. That gave way to the flintlock musket, which was primarily the weapon used to fight the American Revolution with. We see the flint that would cause a spark here, which would ignite a pan full of powder here. Again, that would send a flash inside the barrel, ignite the powder inside the barrel, shoot the musket ball out the end. Progression of the bayonet from the pike. So as the rifle or musket came onto the battlefield, we saw first the advent of the plug bayonet, and that basically would go inside the end of the barrel of the musket at the time, and would turn a musket into essentially a pike, an edged weapon that could stab or slash with. That progressed into a socket bayonet, and that was critical because the plug bayonet would only allow the soldier to shoot their musket one time, then they would plug the end of it with the bayonet, and they no longer had a weapon capable of firing a projectile out the end. The socket bayonet, that allowed the musket to be fired with the bayonet in place and possibly even reloaded if you needed to. So you had multiple shots with the advantage of that edge still being on the rifle or musket at the time. So those are some advancements. The Kentucky long rifle or Pennsylvania long rifle, depends on your preference. Some historians call them each, was something that started to grow on the American frontier. These were individually made rifles, handmade by gunsmiths up mostly in Pennsylvania, used to settle the western frontier, which at the time was Kentucky, hence the slight disagreement on name of whether it's a Kentucky long rifle or a Pennsylvania long rifle. But some key things to remember for them as an infantry weapon, as a fighting weapon here, were that they required individual modes for bullets. If you had a line of troops, musket balls were universal. So if a soldier fell, the person beside him could use his ammunition in their musket. That was not the case with the Kentucky long rifle. The long rifle required its own individual mold for bullets, which meant it wasn't suited for that infantry use, because if you had 20 infantry troops with 20 different long rifles, then you had 20 different bullet molds and 20 different individual lots of ammunition on the line. That was unacceptable because you needed that universal trade-off of ammunition, and that's still a tactic used in military today. When troops go into battle, they're carrying the same type of caliber for that trade-off of ammunition. They also would not accept a standard bayonet. They required their own bayonet. Each rifle was handmade, so slight differences would require its own bayonet to be made for the end of it. When those settlers came to America, or the North American continent as British colonists, they brought with them this idea of defensive fortifications. I won't spend much time on this slide, but we see the Trace Italienne, which is another type of defensive fortification. The American version of that, the colonist version of that, was the frontier fort. So the reason they went with this looks crude in comparison to a castle, but first of all, that was a very common building material. Trees were commonplace. Chopping down trees, the country had not been settled yet. So the heavily forested area, timber was an easy to acquire resource. So they would simply build log structures and make defensive fortifications out of it. Also, the Native Americans were not accustomed to any type of fortification, and as such, they held very little siege technology. So they elaborate fortifications weren't necessary because the primary threat group at that time didn't really have the technology available to climb walls. They didn't have cannons available to blow holes through walls. So very effective at that time for what the colonists were doing with it. Combined arms warfare. That's another concept, another term you're going to hear me use repeatedly, and that is the concept of an infantry line, a line of infantry troops that's supported by artillery barrages, artillery fire, and also cavalry. So cavalry being horseback mounted troops at the time. This would happen a number of ways. It might happen most commonly with an artillery barrage that would blast towards the enemy and try to weaken holes in the enemy line, followed by an infantry assault, a forward advancement of infantry troops, firing, stopping to reload, firing, stopping to reload, that unaimed volley fire that was so prevalent when the infantry lines first became popular. Then that would be supported by a cavalry charge that we would see come along as the enemy's line started to show weaknesses or develop holes in it. the cavalry would come exploit that weakness, charge into that hole. They would mass fires at the breakthrough point. Once that line started to develop a weakness, a potential hole, that would be exploited, and fires would be massed there in great volume. Quick look at just some operational environment differences. We see on the left side of the screen a sack of a European 17th century European town. But when we see look at that picture, look at how populated that town is. Many houses, many businesses, as opposed to Fort Necessity we see on the right, very sparsely populated. That's open country that was probably cleared for the timber to build that fort we see. Very small, very crude, and much different in the way you would go about defending each one of these different fortifications. The Battle of White Mountain on the left, we see a very open battlefield with the remnants of that tercio formation, those larger block formations. On the right, we see the Battle of Kings Mountain, and that infantry line, we see how that infantry line gets impacted whenever they're fighting inside the dense forest in that heavily wooded North American area that we see there. So some differences there. Europe was open, it had been settled, more structures were built up, more solid structures. Now in America it's common to see stone and brick structures. In the 1600s, 1700s, that was not really the case. Most of the structures were more rapidly built log or timber structures. All right, so methods of warfare. Again, those first American settlers brought with them that European influence, that European way of war. That the infantry line we see in this picture, muskets with some mounted bayonets. We do see a spear off to the side there, but mostly the infantry line with muskets and bayonets. To the right, we see a depiction of some Mohawk warriors. We see in that picture war clubs that were used for close combat. We see some rifles, possibly muskets, but edged weapons. We see a tomahawk. And very much the mentality here was ambush, hit and run. They used night raids. They used tactics that were not considered by the European armies at the time. So when the American settlers came here, they were greatly and rapidly introduced to a different way of war. And we see born from that the American militiaman that kind of grew out of that older European influence that was greatly impacted by the Native American tribes that they were in conflict with when they came to America. So large differences between the two, but we start to develop that American militiaman that ultimately went on to fight in the Revolution. Those early colonists, those early militiamen were part-time. They would only train a number of weeks, a number of days, a week, month, or year. Heavy influence on European tactics. Again, that's what they brought with them. That hybrid warfare, though, that's what we see start to develop as they started to adopt some of the Native American tactics and the ambush style, the raids, the hit-and-run tactics that were not part of that European way of war. Again, just another graphic depicting that. One thing I want to point out here is the early colonists had fear of standing armies. The great concerns about the king being able to take over and rule their country with his army, so there was a fear of that. Although they were European colonists, as they started to develop their own militias and their own way of warfare and styles here, that was a great concern. There was significant concerns there, so they were a little bit cautious of a standing professional full-time army and preferred that militiaman who had an occupation, a family, something else to go back to that was not simply the profession of war. This is the British view of an American militiaman. I'll go back and pause there, so if you want to read through some of that, you can. You can pause the video and look up just some of the keys there. You see the origins, the training, some of the uses of the American militiaman in action, and then how effective they might be. That's the American myth, what we view our militiamen as, and that's how the British at the time viewed the American militiamen that were starting to be born and grow. Just a graphic here that shows how the key takeaway from this slide is that as American militias grew here in the Americas, we technically weren't American yet, we were British colonists here. They were militia, little formal training. Their loyalties lay locally, not on any type of national level, but much to their local colonies. And European armies, they were professional. They were becoming funded by the state, by the government. Very formal training, professional armies. Their officers were career professionals, and they had loyalties to the state that funded them and trained them. French and Indian War, there's a reading about this. The key takeaway I want to leave you with the French and Indian War is that helped develop many of the American leaders that would go on to serve in the Revolution, and help develop and form them into the very leaders that they were later on, and helped really shape that unique American experience. So most notably being Lieutenant Colonel George Washington, who served in the French and Indian War, later commanded the American forces. So ultimately this war was fought over this disputed territory right here, critical for trade. I live in the state of Kentucky, and it is hard for me to imagine that at one time war was fought over control of our country, because it was such a critical piece of trade for this Ohio River Valley and where it joins into the Mississippi right there. Some key battles you'll read about a little bit. Pay attention to Rogers Rangers as you conduct your reading. And it was one of our first elite units, our first experiences with unconventional warfare. They were highly effective during this war. Later on, those experiences would help us win the Revolution. All right, as we start to get towards now the American Revolution, which will be the focus for the next video in the next class, is we see that Great Britain, and we see some of the differences. I'll go ahead and populate this screen for you. And you can pause it here and read each one of these and think on it if you want to. But the key takeaway I want you to see here is how Great Britain on the left viewed the American militia versus how America viewed itself. And you see some stark differences. Americans wanted freedom. British looked at the British military looked at the colonists as a way to feed, supply, equip, and even house their armies. So that was some significant problems. Critical that you pay attention to the bottom statement here, that the British wanted to tax the American colonists to help support and fund and finance some of the military operations, and some disagreements grew over that, significant disagreements. This graphic just shows some of the immigration over to the 13 colonies. And now we start to see, as we wrap this up, that U.S. Army traditions. The American military is reliant at this time, prior to and leading into the early days of the American Revolution, really reliant upon militia and volunteers. Culturally, Americans, the British colonists of the American colonies, had a fear of a standing army. They wanted to see civilians in control, and to this day, the American president controls our military. He is the commander-in-chief as a civilian. He is not a member of the military, although he commands it. And Americans wanted individualistic and independent, free-thinking soldiers, which now is widely accepted and commonplace, but that was, especially at that time, was a bit of a difference because the British wanted a more subordinate, more of just a soldier who would come in, take orders, be a good soldier, and not question anything. Americans wanted us to be free thinking and make our own decisions about things. So if you have any questions, email me, reach out, conduct the readings. There's a short assignment I've put in the room as well. So reach out to me if you have any questions, and thank you so much for taking the time to watch this.